morning. I'm Shawn Blaydes, and I'm currently exploring how we can display great powers competition in competitive wargaming. We kicked this project off because competition is a continually evolving concept, and it tends to be pretty difficult, especially when you're talking to junior soldiers about how we act as a military force in order to collaborate with our interagency partners to create effect. We've determined really that there's room for growth and professional development in this area. We like to stress the fact that tactical actions can have strategic effect when competing, and the importance of interagency, intergovernmental, and multinational cooperation can't be stressed enough. What you do on the ground can have an outsized effect for the duration. So why competitive wargaming? It allows perspectives to gain new perspective. Those participants get to interact with the dynamics and have a discussion about it while they're playing the game in a competitive environment, and allows them to take actions from both sides. It's a safe environment. We can make mistakes, we can grow, we can have discussion, and ultimately, it's a chance to learn and experience something new for a lot of people. It enables the synthesis of information from across a large set of fields of study. So you can touch on things like economics, military history, interagency cooperation, sociology, all at the same time. And then finally, it exposes participants to recent events to inform their decision-making in the future by developing an understanding of the past. So starting off, what are we going to display? Why build a game about competition? There's three dynamics that had built the base of how we understand competition. They're influence, leverage, and advantage. Colonel Steve Ferenzi's delivered a series of talks, which have been very informative, and written a series of articles synthesizing a lot of information, and he's brought it down to these three, which we really like. Influence can be defined as the act or power to produce a desired outcome or end on a target audience. This is the latest, greatest from JP 3-13, but it hasn't been updated since 2014. Which there's probably room for advancement in this area. People are looking at this. We've been part of that conversation, but by and large, we're waiting to see which direction we want to go with the actual definition of influence and how we act upon that. Leverage. The Army's defined it as relative advantage in combat power or other circumstances against an enemy or adversary. Looking at it below the threshold of armed conflict, we can modify that and say that we can gain advantage in all aspects of national power. And building this game has really given us an opportunity to analyze that and look at what advantage might be in different areas. When we talk about advantage, a lot of times we talk about terrain. And I think as we move forward, we have to talk about advantage in terms of organizational advantage. Who are our partners? How can we interact with them? What effects can we achieve based on our relationships? And then finally, peer threats. We talk about competition and conflict in terms of threats, adversaries, hazards. Threats being more kinetically focused, adversaries being people that have varying interests, maybe divergent from our own. And then when we talk about hazards, we talk about things that exist in the natural environment. So if you had a tsunami, it'd be a good example of a hazard. But there's also a possibility that not friendly infrastructure might be hazardous as well to U.S. interest overseas. So when we talked about synthesizing a large amount of information very quickly, I'm going to cover this rapidly because I don't want to bore people to death. But we talk about the application of smart power as Dr. Joseph Nye defined it. It's the application of soft power, those diplomatic or economic actions, and then hard power, also military and economic actions, all underlined by information, how we distribute it, receive it, understand it, analyze it, and synthesize it across the spectrum of conflict. Influence mechanisms. Adam Wright has defined influence mechanisms he's put them into four categories: assurance, deterrence, inducement, and compellence. Trying to synthesize those soft power and hard power constructs and how we can elicit an effect from our friends and adversaries. And then finally, Colonel Selesky talks about conflict across the spectrum, from political warfare, very much based on the idea that we should be engaging with people diplomatically, and using other elements of national power to support, all the way through to conventional warfare with large-scale formations, tanks, artillery, and the whole nine. Or we can play a game. While the game's not the be-all, end-all or a stopgap for education, what it is a chance to expose people rapidly to those concepts and have a discussion about it. So where do I start? This is my first attempt at developing a game board depicting the East Africa date scenario, and it's not the most beautiful thing I've ever produced. This is where we're currently at. Looks a little more refined. For those of you who played Twilight Struggle, it might look a little familiar. And I hope so. Some of the play dynamics will reflect. So the East Africa date scenario takes place south of the Horn of Africa and consists of 4 countries, Amari, Nyumba, Ziwa, and Kujenga, who are friendly to the US or not. One of the biggest things, one of the most helpful things for developing a game is that it had a pre-developed or pre-mapped infrastructure architecture to include planned infrastructure in the future. The actors in this game, so there's 6 state actors. The US and Olvana are in direct competition, and the 4 state actors in the region of East Africa are secondary in the terms of they're non-playable. Actions will occur in their terrain, their political interests will be reflected, and their historic positions will be reflected in the game, but they can't be directly played outside of partnered military forces. There are 2 non-state actors, the Army of Justice and Purity in the south, and then Hizbul al-Harakat in the north. Both of these can pose problems to infrastructure investment and influence attempts in cities, but they can be managed as well, in large part through cooperation with international organizations. COMESA, or the Common Market for Eastern and Southern Africa, and the East African community are able to be engaged to develop economic ties in the region. And the United Nations performs a number of functions from assistance with refugee problems all the way through to peacekeeping forces that can help with some of the non-state actors. And then, of course, the African Union continues to provide security forces throughout the region to help stabilize portions of Africa that are in need. So how do you influence these organizations? How do you create an ability to conduct action in the environment? It's primarily through the expenditure of influence points. So influence can be seen as the expenditure of national funds, providing personnel, time, or influence into an organization to try to increase engagement. Each of the 3 types of cards here, Olvanan-oriented cards on the left side of the screen with the green diamond, US cards with the blue star in the middle, and neutral cards with the white clover on the right can be spent to place influence in cities in each one of these countries. Or you can invest in international organizations. If you invest in these international organizations, you can receive tokens, which you can place to either stop non-state actors from expanding, recruiting, or conducting attacks, or into economic activities to try to stabilize and grow opportunity for people to perhaps give them a different alternative from joining these organizations. Movement on the game board. So if we go back to the data infrastructure diagram from before, and we look at how the game board's organized, we've chosen to use the movement, pathway movement as per, or as was demonstrated in Twilight Struggle, because it allows actors to move from city to city. Now we've made the choice to allow people to start interaction in any country, either in the capital, assuming that they can make diplomatic engagement, or through the ports. We know ports remain important for economic activity across the world, and we know there's been large infrastructure investment in ports, so it seemed like a good place to enter. Now, cross-border movement has been restricted to only those places where rail or road, established road infrastructure is present. Although this area is fairly tightly connected, some of those roads are in poor condition, so we've only focused on major highways. It limits a player's ability to spread from one country to another, but it also forces them to determine which pathways they want to prioritize, you can see that each one of those cities in the upper right-hand corner has a value. Much like Twilight Struggle, that stability value determines the amount of influence you have to exert to create goodwill and create an effect in that location. Now, something a little different is you'll see infrastructure markers in between. So in between Garissa and Lamu, for example, is a part of the future planned LAPEX corridor, and it will cost 3 influence points to establish that. And then you'll have to maintain control over it if you don't control the non-state actors, who will either establish their own control or damage your investment. Turns and time span. So the time duration for this, the time span covered, is about an 8-year period, starting in 2014, ending in 2025. I apologize, an 11-year period. It consists of 96 iterations, broken down into 6 turns of 8 rounds each. Those 6 turns are further broken down into 2-turn blocks. So 2014 to 17, 18, 21, etc. And this works out really well because it roughly aligns with how infrastructure investment in Africa has been announced at the national level. The Belt and Road Initiative, although announced in 2013, was really instituted in 2014 with those framework agreements and memorandums of understanding between states. We had our turn to great power competition in the United States, starting with the 2017 National Security Strategy. And then recently we've announced Build Back Better World, and then also the Green Belt and Road Initiative, competing for influence and increasing investment in the region. Turns, players take turns, alternating actions, moving forces and exerting influence. The initiative is determined by decision at the beginning of each turn. We're still fleshing this mechanism out. I like the headline phase from Twilight Struggle, but it seems like it should be more deliberate. So we're trying to make the historical tie to determine who will have initiative in each turn, to make sure that it reflects what actually happened. Something that should be fun moving into the future is that 2021 really marks a turning point. As Build Back Better World and Green BRI are announced, we don't know how it's going to turn out. So we've tried to leave that open so that it's more chance-based moving into the future than it has been historical-based in the past. So what is influence? Influence in terms of this game is calculated in terms of your investment and influence in each city and region and a state. So the scoring rounds from Twilight Struggle have been retained, establishing presence, influence, and control over different areas, and rewarding victory points for such. When we demonstrate and we model leverage in the game, we've broken that down into your ability to influence what international organizations, economic blocks, and military blocks are going to do, which results in the marked advantage of you being able to move their forces on the board. And then finally, what infrastructure you can control. If your state or your stated objective in the game is to extract resources or to import and distribute resources to a region, then you need to make sure that you have adequate infrastructure to do so. Otherwise, you're going to suffer in your endeavors. And then what is advantage? So fairly heavily modified the space race track, which is one of my favorite features, to try to include each one of the 4 major levers of international power to determine who has advantage in the region. The assumption for this is that maintaining a marked advantage in an area will give you the ability to exert additional influence in the future, or institute policy from a position of advantage, hopefully to your benefit. Interestingly, the rule set for Twilight Struggle includes a note that the space race track was built to be a let-off valve or a steam valve for cards you could not play, absolutely would not play. So we tried to retain that and the ability to expend cards, but we've also, but we've also tried to make sure it's conditions-based, because establishing advantage isn't just about putting bad influence points, so to speak, into a track, but it's also about, hey, what do you control? What advantages do you have? What have been your priorities, and what are the outcomes of that? So we still leave the dice there to determine your ability to move. because we don't want people to be able to bum rush advantage tracks and be able to rapidly gain victory points and establish or meet victory conditions right out of the gate. We want them to play through the game. But at the same time, we do want to make it a deliberate investment. I do want to go back to one other slide real quick. So as an educational tool, training junior soldiers or giving them an opportunity to experience some of what has happened is a big part of this. So as we built our card set, which, if you don't mind my saying, is the worst thing you can possibly do in a game ever. I don't recommend it. I would give it a 0 of 5 stars if possible. That's not completely true, but it has been difficult balancing the amount of influence points gained or you're able to expend versus the points resulting from the card's event play. So if a player chooses to play the event, if it's one of their cards that's friendly to their faction, they can, and a lot of times that'll be the preferred method. However, that event is tied to information about what happened during that event below it, and then a citation so that people can find more information. And I don't expect people to run off and grab the citation and go start Googling every card that's out there. But what we have done in my thesis is tried to tie those in an appendix to show what recent events have been relevant in the competition space, and then also allow us the opportunity to identify trends. Each one of the state actors here that are playable, Ovan in the US, have stated national positions, national priorities, and have tried to stick with those. And you can see in independent media reporting that they've stuck with some policy and not with others. So while background's provided on the state policy, the cards really show what they have and have not chosen to do, at least as reported by the media. And then finally, before we go into questions, the last attempt in this game and what we're working through right now is building asymmetry. And the way that we've tried to build asymmetry is by allowing states to take specific actions during their turns. The US is specifically allowed to invest in an organization or choose an organization to partner with each turn, which allows them to establish a steady flow of influence into that organization to try to establish control, but more importantly, to collaborate with them, to move forces within the game board or on the game board, to do things like alleviate refugee suffering. That might seem a little outside of the norm for a war game, but if you don't control or if you don't alleviate some of that suffering, you can't predict what the fallout will be from the movement of people as they try to seek security and stability. And it can also exacerbate things like terrorist recruiting, where, for example, Al-Shabaab has gone into refugee camps and attempted to recruit disadvantaged people so that they can execute their military strategy, which is not a good thing for anybody, I think, at the end of the day. The Olvanan faction is able to choose an infrastructure corridor, either originating in Dar es Salaam, Mombasa, or Lamu, and rapidly invest into that infrastructure to try to establish control over it. If they're able to do that, they're able to extract additional resources and increase the amount of influence they can exert in the region. So it's not an incredibly asymmetric game like you would find in something like Vast or Root, but it is something that you would find in the real world, reflecting national strategies and trends previously, either attempting to provide stability through international cooperation on the US side, or for Olvana, attempting to extract resources and then on the return side, distribute products so that people will purchase things from your home and increase your ability to increase GDP and GNP, or gross domestic and gross national product. So we've covered a lot of information in this game, and I apologize that this couldn't be a longer conversation, but as we're developing the game, it continues to evolve and it continues to grow in scope. And what it really does is it attempts to encompass those 3 theoretical frameworks covered earlier into one holistic framework that people can interact with in a very short period of time instead of spending several months studying. including Reitz's model for influence, including Nye's model for hard power, soft power, and ultimately smart power, and then addressing some of Colonel Selesky's concerns about how we're competing across the continuum, all the way from peace through to conflict, in each phase of the competition continuum in between. At this point, I'd be interested to hear if there's any questions or continue the conversation about what we're trying to do and specific dynamics you'd be interested in. From Dragoon Commander, this tool seems to be focused on exposing people to concepts rather than specifically simulating events. Is that a correct understanding? It's trying to do both. So yes, it's trying to expose them to concepts, and it's trying to get them to the point where they understand on a spectrum how we apply elements of national power. And that's a broad statement. I don't know that it's useful. I think a better statement or a more useful statement would be, we're trying to get people to understand that we must engage across the whole of the US government, both from small tactical military actions, whether that be security cooperation, or whether that be, a JSET, or even a port stop from a naval ship in a town, to ensure that they understand that, we're there, we're friendly, we are trying to promote what we believe is good for the international order. I'm thinking specifically about freedom of navigation patrols, or whether it be USAID promoting economic growth in a town or a village to increase quality of life and increase stability, or whether that be Department of State going out there and engaging on a regular basis to demonstrate American ideals on the ground and promote American ideals as we establish relations or increase our relations with other countries. So it's not about one thing. It's about engagement across the spectrum of the entire US government, but it's also about people understanding those recent events. So, and I'm sorry I'm long-winded. In a historic war game, you have the time, you have the ability to synthesize data and identify key points along the route. We've identified some key points along the route, but being so recent in history, we're not able to model historic events quite as cleanly as you would be in a historic war game. I hope that wasn't too long and raving. From Dragoon Commander, can you discuss some of the variables, incidents, capabilities you have included as elements in the card decks? Absolutely. So we've tried to not wear rose-colored glasses on this. As you can see in the early competition card for Alvana on the left with the green diamond, civilian casualties, you remove all U.S. influence from 2 cities in Nyumba, and that's based on the event, well, not the event, the report. U.S. admits to killing up to 116 civilians across Horn of Africa, Middle East, and Central Asia. That was a news article released from Reuters based on a U.S. report. So Alvana is able to leverage that information against the United States. Conversely, the Security and Training Management Organization for the U.S. Army goes out and regularly helps countries integrate capabilities to increase their ability to provide security within their national borders, which I would say is a very good thing to do. So, it's both sides of the card, so to speak, but also admitting that, one, events are often not perceived the way they're intended to. Things are often, state and non-state actors are able to twist information, disinformation, misinformation, or choosing how to portray information in a manner that's beneficial to them. And understanding that the information environment is part of the environment we have to operate in today. And then finally, for the neutral events, we try to let those swing either way. So those neutral events can be of benefit to either party, or can be of detriment to both parties. There's a card I don't have in this presentation, but it's called Give Cooperation a Chance. And it asks the question, can this be beneficial to both of us? And in that card, both the US and Alvana can place 4 influence points if they agree on where they're going to place them. And if they don't agree, then regional stability degrades. A key aspect of this game that should be talked about is it attempts to keep the entire game below the threshold of armed conflict. So while military forces move across the board, in terms of non-state actors, the Hezbollah Harakat and the Army of Justice and Peace, and while the U.S. can partner with nations to move security forces to address those destabilizing factors, if the regional stability decreases far enough, it will result in great powers conflict as opposed to great powers competition. The understanding is that conflict's not good for anybody. It's expensive. It doesn't advance national objectives. It doesn't increase the ability for people to conduct trade or diplomatic engagement. So we want people to specifically stay below the threshold of armed conflict with the threat of it hanging out there. So those cards can swing either way. There are penalties for doing things that aren't particularly nice in the international realm, because we understand that those can be leveraged against people for information advantage. The specific audience. So this game is specifically targeted, well, you know, who is the audience? It would be me, of course. So I've worked in the civil affairs field now for several years, and the target audience is junior civil affairs personnel coming in, at least in my mind, but I think it can be broader than that. This is a result of things that I wish I had understood coming out the gate, but are difficult to teach. It requires a long time, a lot of reading, a lot of study, a lot of conversation to get people to understand some of the concepts here. And that's not a bad thing. Some people get it quicker than others. And we built this to be a tool to rapidly introduce those concepts to people across the board. Whoever's conducting engagement, that could be a company commander taking a company to go conduct live fire training with a partner nation, a civil affairs officer liaising with the local embassy, you know, or somebody providing humanitarian assistance, disaster response relief in an area that that's been negatively impacted by a natural disaster, for example.